At exactly 5:15 every morning, before the first visitors reached Arlington National Cemetery, Dorothy Simpson quietly knelt beside the grave of a fallen soldier. Wrapped in a faded gray coat, the homeless woman brushed away damp leaves, replaced a handful of fresh wildflowers, and carefully laid a weathered Polaroid against the cold marble. A black SUV slowed nearby. Inside, billionaire Isaiah Brooks froze. The soldier smiling in that old photograph was his father, a man he had believed the world had forgotten. But who was this woman? And why had she kept showing up before dawn for years without anyone ever noticing? Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from, and what your local time is right now. And if stories about quiet courage and unexpected kindness speak to your heart, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next journey. At 4:15 every morning, long before Washington, D.C. began clearing the sleep from its eyes, Dorothy Simpson woke without the need for an alarm. The old silver minivan she called home creaked softly whenever she shifted beneath the worn navy blanket folded over her shoulders. Moisture coated the inside of the windshield, turning the distant streetlights into pale yellow smudges. She rubbed a small circle clear with the sleeve of her coat and glanced toward the dashboard clock. 4:15. Right on time, she whispered to herself. She reached beneath the passenger seat and pulled out a neatly folded plastic grocery bag. Inside were the same belongings she organized every evening. Before falling asleep, a faded gray towel, a small bottle of glass cleaner that was only 1/3 full, a soft horsehair brush with half its bristles, missing a pair of gardening gloves, a reusable water bottle, and a carefully wrapped bundle inside a zip-top freezer bag. She touched the bundle gently, but didn't open it. Not yet. Everything had its proper time. Dorothy believed that discipline was the only possession nobody could steal from a person. Outside, the July air carried the damp scent of freshly cut grass. She opened the van door quietly so the hinges wouldn't squeal and disturb the other people sleeping in their vehicles across the church parking lot. An elderly man sleeping inside an aging pickup truck raised a hand without opening his eyes. "Morning, Miss Dorothy," she smiled. "Morning, Frank. Stay cool today." "You too." No more words were needed. They had shared the parking lot for nearly 7 months. Neither of them ever asked how the other had ended up there. Some stories deserved privacy. Dorothy folded her blanket with military precision before placing it inside a plastic storage bin. She brushed invisible wrinkles from her coat, tied back her graying curls beneath a dark knit cap, and checked her reflection in the cracked side mirror. Her face looked older than 45. Life had a way of adding years without asking permission. Still, she straightened her collar. Charles had always said, "You don't dress for the world, Dot. You dress to remind yourself who you are." She could almost hear his voice every morning. The bus stop across the street, slowly filled with commuters carrying travel mugs and briefcases. None of them noticed the woman stepping out of an old minivan. That was all right. Dorothy had grown used to being invisible. She walked 12 minutes to Grace Turner's Sunrise Diner, arriving exactly at 4:45. The neon open sign had just flickered to life. Grace was already inside, rolling biscuit dough. Without looking up, she called toward the kitchen entrance. "Coffee's ready, Dorothy." Dorothy hung her coat on the familiar hook. "Morning, Grace." Grace Turner was 54, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and blessed with the kind of smile that could survive decades of disappointment. She never asked Dorothy embarrassing questions. Instead, she simply created opportunities. "You mind wiping the windows before customers start coming?" "Of course. And after that, stack the pie boxes." Dorothy nodded. She knew the arrangement by heart. Grace insisted she wasn't hiring Dorothy. Dorothy insisted she wasn't accepting charity. So every morning they silently honored the same agreement. Dorothy helped prepare the diner before sunrise. Grace paid her $38 in cash and packed breakfast into a brown paper bag. Neither woman ever used the word help. It preserved both dignity and friendship. The first rays of dawn had not yet touched the sky when Dorothy finished polishing the front windows. She wiped each corner twice, straightened every sugar dispenser, adjusted every chair until each one lined perfectly beneath the tables. Grace watched from behind the counter. "You ever think about slowing down?" Dorothy smiled. "If I slow down, my thoughts catch me." Grace didn't ask what those thoughts were. Instead, she slid a steaming cup of black coffee across the counter. "Take 5 minutes." Dorothy wrapped both hands around the mug. Warmth spread into fingers that always seemed cold. Grace placed a fresh blueberry muffin beside it. "I baked extra." "You always bake extra." Grace grinned. "I keep forgetting how many I made." Dorothy laughed softly. It was one of the few sounds that still resembled the woman she used to be. At exactly 5:02 she stood. Grace reached beneath the register and handed her a folded brown envelope. 38. Dorothy counted it carefully. Not because she doubted Grace, because Charles had once told her, "Always know exactly what you've earned." She slipped $30 into one pocket, $8 into another. Every dollar already had a destination. 5 for gasoline, 2 for the laundromat, 1 toward replacing the cracked plastic covering that protected the photograph. The math never changed. As she prepared to leave, Grace noticed Dorothy looking toward the bouquet of unsold wildflowers near the front entrance. Without saying anything, Grace picked up 3 white daisies and a single blue cornflower. "They're already wilting." Dorothy accepted them with both hands. "They're beautiful." "They'll look better where you're taking them." Dorothy smiled again. "Thank you." By 5:12, she reached Arlington National Cemetery. The eastern sky had begun turning pale blue. Birdsong echoed softly between endless rows of white marble headstones. Dorothy stopped at the visitor fountain. She filled her reusable bottle, dampened the towel, adjusted the flowers. Only then did she continue walking. She never hurried once inside the cemetery. Every step seemed measured, almost ceremonial. She knew exactly where she was going without looking at the map. Section 60, row after row, passed quietly beside her until she stopped before one particular grave. Captain Samuel Brooks, United States Army. A small American flag fluttered gently beside the polished marble. Dorothy knelt slowly. The movement had become harder over the years. Her knees often protested. She ignored them. She began exactly as always. She removed fallen leaves one by one, pulled tiny weeds growing near the stone, brushed dust from each engraved letter with the worn horsehair brush, wiped the marble with slow, circular motions until morning light reflected softly across its surface. Then she replaced the old flowers with the fresh ones Grace had quietly given her. Only after everything else was finished did Dorothy remove the zip-top freezer bag from inside her coat. She opened it carefully. Inside rested a faded Polaroid whose edges had turned ivory with age. The plastic sleeve protecting it had been taped so many times, it looked more like clear patchwork than transparent film. She rested the photograph gently against the base of the headstone. For several silent moments, she simply looked at it. A younger Charles stood smiling beside Captain Samuel Brooks. Their uniforms were dusty. Their arms rested over each other's shoulders. Neither looked older than 23. Dorothy softly traced the corner of the photograph. Then, almost too quietly to hear, she repeated the same sentence she had spoken every morning for years. "No one is forgotten while someone still shows up." The breeze carried her words through the quiet cemetery. Unseen behind a row of oak trees, another pair of eyes watched. Harold Jenkins, the cemetery manager, stood with folded arms. Beside him, Officer Brian Collins shook his head. "There she is again," Harold sighed. "Every single morning." "You still think she's harmless?" "I don't know," Brian frowned. "She's homeless." Harold kept watching Dorothy from a distance. "I've learned that being homeless doesn't tell me who someone is." Brian looked unconvinced. Rules are changing next week. I know. We'll have to stop letting people come in before opening. Harold remained silent. His eyes never left Dorothy. She wasn't talking. She wasn't asking visitors for money. She wasn't sleeping on a bench. She simply sat before one forgotten grave, as though the entire world had disappeared around her. When Dorothy finally picked up the old photograph and carefully sealed it back inside its plastic sleeve, she gently touched 2 fingers against the polished marble. I'll see you tomorrow. Then she stood, picked up her bucket, and quietly walked away beneath the first golden light of sunrise. Neither she nor the 2 men watching from the shadows noticed the black SUV entering the cemetery through the eastern gate. Isaiah Brooks had spent most of his life believing that the quieter he became, the less the world could disappoint him. By every public measure, he was a remarkable success. At 58, he was one of the country's most respected technology entrepreneurs. His software company had transformed logistics across North America before he sold it for billions. Newspapers loved calling him the billionaire who disappeared because, unlike so many executives, he avoided interviews, charity galas, and television appearances whenever possible. Yet every Memorial Day, Veterans Day, and the anniversary of his father's death, he disappeared for a different reason. He drove himself. No security convoy, no photographers, no assistants. Just a black SUV, a cup of black coffee, and a destination he rarely admitted mattered more to him than any boardroom. Arlington National Cemetery. Only Emily Carter knew this habit. She had served as Isaiah's executive assistant for nearly 11 years. When she arrived at his Georgetown office shortly after 7 that morning, she was surprised to see him already there. He stood alone before the enormous windows overlooking the Potomac River, still wearing the same navy jacket he had worn to the cemetery before sunrise. His untouched coffee sat on the desk. Emily set her tablet down carefully. You've been here since 6. Isaiah nodded without turning around. I canceled breakfast. You have the Veterans Legacy Foundation meeting at 9. I know, she hesitated. Everything all right? Silence lingered. Finally, he spoke. I saw someone this morning. Emily waited. She had learned years ago that Isaiah never appreciated interruptions. A homeless woman. Emily blinked. At Arlington. Yes. What was she doing? Isaiah slowly faced her. Cleaning my father's grave. Emily frowned. I'm sorry, your father's... He nodded once. Captain Samuel Brooks. Emily had seen the framed military photograph hanging quietly in Isaiah's office. The picture was small, almost hidden, unlike every business award displayed throughout the building. Isaiah rarely spoke about his father. His employees knew only fragments. Captain Samuel Brooks had died in military service decades earlier. Isaiah had been 6 years old. His mother never remarried. Money had always been scarce. His father's military medals had spent years inside a cardboard box because looking at them hurt too much. Isaiah walked toward the photograph now resting against his office bookshelf. He picked it up. I used to think he was forgotten. Emily looked confused. What changed? I watched a stranger spend 20 minutes taking care of his grave. He paused. Not because anyone was watching. His voice became quieter. Because nobody was. Emily remained silent. Isaiah looked toward the city again. I've visited that grave dozens of times. I've never seen her. Today was different. What made you stop? Isaiah's eyes narrowed slightly, replaying the scene in his mind. It wasn't just the cleaning. It was deliberate. He remembered every movement. The woman had brushed away each leaf individually, straightened the tiny American flag after the breeze bent it sideways, polished the marble until sunrise reflected across the engraved name, placed fresh flowers. Then, the photograph. Isaiah could still see it, an old Polaroid, only for a moment, but long enough. He recognized his father's smile instantly. Not because he had many photographs of Samuel Brooks. There were very few. His mother had guarded them like priceless heirlooms. One image in particular had always remained in Isaiah's memory. His father laughing beside another young soldier, arms over each other's shoulders, dust covering their uniforms. The same photograph, or one almost identical. Isaiah looked back toward Emily. "I've never seen that picture outside our family." Emily slowly sat down. "You think she knew him?" "I don't know. You could ask." Isaiah gave a faint smile. "If someone spends years doing something without asking for recognition." He shook his head. "The first thing you don't do is interrupt." Emily understood. That sounded exactly like him. "Would you like me to find out who she is?" Isaiah didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the leather notebook he always carried. Inside were handwritten notes rather than digital reminders. One page contained only a single sentence. Success should never become louder than gratitude. His late mother had written those words. He traced them lightly with his thumb. "I don't want anyone bothering her." Emily nodded. So let's observe first." 3 days later, Isaiah returned. Again he arrived before sunrise. Again he parked well beyond the visitor entrance. Again Dorothy Simpson appeared precisely at 5:15. Nothing about her routine changed. She entered carrying the same bucket, the same folded towel, the same small bundle tucked carefully beneath her coat. Isaiah remained inside the SUV, engine off. Windows lowered just enough to hear birds singing between the rows of white marble. He watched Dorothy remove tiny weeds from around the grave, one by one. Not because anyone would notice, because she would. After nearly 20 minutes, another visitor approached nearby, carrying an expensive bouquet of red roses. The man glanced briefly toward Dorothy before muttering under his breath, "Some people will do anything for sympathy." Dorothy heard him. Isaiah knew she had. Her shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. Yet she never looked up, never defended herself, never explained. She simply continued cleaning. The visitor walked away. Isaiah frowned. He had attended enough charity events to recognize something uncomfortable. People often preferred quick assumptions over patient observation. From a distance, Dorothy looked exactly like what strangers expected to see. An aging homeless woman, second-hand coat, scuffed shoes, plastic bucket. Nothing impressive, nothing important. Except Isaiah had watched enough now to know appearances had lied. He glanced at his watch. 5:39. Dorothy carefully removed the old photograph. She rested it against the stone, closed her eyes. Her lips moved, too quietly to hear. After less than a minute, she placed the picture back inside its protective plastic. No dramatic gestures, no tears, no audience. She stood, picked up her supplies, and quietly walked away. Isaiah waited another 10 minutes before leaving the vehicle. When he finally reached his father's grave, everything looked immaculate. The marble reflected the morning sky. Fresh flowers stood neatly arranged. Even the brass military emblem had been polished. Isaiah crouched slowly. His fingertips brushed the edge of the headstone. The stone still felt slightly damp. She had only just left. For reasons he couldn't explain, that realization affected him more than any memorial speech he'd ever heard. Someone had cared enough to come before sunrise. Not once, not twice, apparently for years. He looked toward the neighboring graves. Many showed signs of neglect, weathered flowers, dust, wind-blown leaves. His father's did not. Isaiah whispered quietly, "Who are you?" The only reply came from rustling oak leaves overhead. That afternoon, Isaiah attended the Veterans Legacy Foundation planning meeting. Executives discussed fundraising targets, construction budgets, public relations, television partnerships. Everyone spoke confidently. Everyone wanted bigger numbers, larger campaigns, more visibility. Isaiah listened patiently. Then one board member announced proudly, "We're planning a nationwide advertising campaign reminding Americans to honor our veterans." The room nodded. Isaiah remained thoughtful. Finally, he asked, "How much?" The finance director answered immediately, "About $12 million. Isaiah looked around the room. $12 million. Everyone nodded again. He leaned back quietly. This morning. The room became silent. I watched one woman honor a veteran with a bucket of water, 3 wildflowers, and 20 minutes of her time. Nobody spoke. Isaiah continued, "I wonder which investment mattered more." No one had an answer. Even Emily looked down at her notes. Isaiah wasn't criticizing the foundation. He genuinely wanted them to think. Gratitude measured in money often became performance. Gratitude measured in consistency became character. When the meeting ended, Isaiah walked out alone. Emily caught up beside him in the hallway. "You've been thinking about her all day." He smiled faintly. "Is it that obvious?" "A little." He looked toward the elevator. "I've spent years trying to preserve my father's legacy." Emily nodded. And someone with almost nothing may have done a better job than I have." As the elevator doors closed, neither of them noticed Harold Jenkins standing across the lobby speaking quietly with Officer Brian Collins. Harold looked troubled. "The new access policy starts Monday." Brian nodded. "I know." Harold glanced toward the cemetery, visible through the large front windows. "I'm not sure how she's going to take it." Brian shrugged. "Rules are rules." Harold sighed. "Sometimes." He watched the sunrise fade completely into daylight. "But sometimes—" His voice trailed off. "Rules arrive before we've learned someone's story." Long before Dorothy Simpson became the quiet woman carrying a bucket through Arlington at dawn, she had been known for something entirely different. She had the kind of laugh that made hospital hallways feel less sterile. For nearly 17 years, she worked as a certified nursing assistant at St. Mary's Rehabilitation Center outside Richmond, Virginia. Patients requested her by name. Nurses trusted her without hesitation. Families often remembered Dorothy long after they forgot the names of doctors. She had never earned much money. But every Friday afternoon she drove home, believing she had done work that mattered. Waiting there was Charles Simpson. He always greeted her the same way. The front door would open before she reached the porch. "There you are, Dot." "And there you are." Those simple words became their evening ritual. The small brick house they rented wasn't impressive. The kitchen cabinets were older than both of them. The living room carpet had faded where sunlight poured through the front window every afternoon. The air conditioner complained loudly every July. Yet Charles insisted they lived in the richest house on the block. "Because," he would say, while setting 2 plates on the tiny dining table, "peace is expensive, and somehow we've got it for free." Dorothy usually laughed. "Nothing's free." "It is if you build it together." For a long time they had. Charles had served in the army in his early 20s. He rarely discussed those years. Not because he was ashamed, because some memories refused to stay in the past once spoken aloud. Dorothy understood that silence could also be a form of love. She never forced questions. Instead, she noticed little things. He never sat with his back to restaurant doors. Fireworks on the 4th of July always made him flinch before smiling awkwardly and pretending everything was fine. Every night before bed, he checked every window twice, sometimes 3 times. Other people called it habit. Dorothy recognized it as survival that had forgotten the war was over. Still, Charles remained remarkably gentle. Neighborhood children adored him because he repaired broken bicycles without accepting payment. When an elderly widow down the street couldn't start her car one winter morning, Charles spent 4 freezing hours fixing the engine. When Dorothy teased him afterward, he simply shrugged. "Someone once did something bigger for me." She asked what he meant. He smiled. "Maybe one day." Then changed the subject. Years passed. The nightmares slowly became more frequent. Then came the panic attacks, the headaches, the insomnia. Finally, the diagnosis everyone had quietly expected but feared hearing: post-traumatic stress disorder. The counselor explained that trauma often grew louder with age instead of softer. Charles listened politely. Dorothy squeezed his hand. On the drive home, neither of them spoke until they reached a traffic light. Charles stared ahead. "I thought I was stronger than this." Dorothy turned toward him. "No. You don't understand." "I do." He finally looked at her. "No, Dot." His voice cracked for the first time. "I survived overseas." His fingers tightened around the steering wheel. "And now I'm losing to memories." Dorothy reached across the center console and covered his hand with hers. "You're not losing. I'm forgetting who I used to be." She smiled gently. "Then we'll remember together." That became another promise between them. Every difficult morning, every sleepless night, every unexpected flashback. She reminded him who he still was, not who the war had tried to make him become. As the years passed, Charles could no longer work full-time. Dorothy accepted extra shifts, weekend shifts, holiday shifts, night shifts. She never complained. The mortgage payments became harder. Medical bills piled higher every month. Savings disappeared quietly. One evening, Dorothy found Charles sitting alone in the garage. The lights were off. He held an old wooden box across his lap. She recognized it immediately. He had owned it for decades, yet she had never seen him open it. He looked up. "You've earned this." She sat beside him. Slowly, Charles lifted the lid. Inside rested only 3 things: a military identification tag, a folded letter yellowed by time, and a faded Polaroid wrapped inside several layers of protective plastic. He handled the photograph more carefully than crystal. Dorothy leaned closer. 2 young soldiers smiled at the camera, both filthy, both exhausted, both somehow laughing. Charles pointed toward the other man. "That's Samuel Brooks." Dorothy studied the face. Strong jaw, bright eyes, easy smile. "He was your best friend?" Charles nodded slowly. "My brother." She looked back at him. "You never told me." "I couldn't." "Why?" Charles closed his eyes. "Because every time I looked at this picture," he swallowed hard, "I remembered that only one of us came home." Silence settled around them. Dorothy reached for his hand. Charles opened the folded letter. Its edges had become fragile with age. It was written by Samuel's commanding officer after the mission. Dorothy watched him unfold it. His hands trembled. "He saved 3 of us," Charles whispered. "But he went back one more time." "For who?" Charles stared at the photograph. "For me." Dorothy felt tears gathering before she even understood the story. Charles smiled sadly. "He pushed me into the evacuation helicopter. And then, he never made it back." The garage became completely still. Outside, children rode bicycles down the street. Someone nearby mowed a lawn. Life continued exactly as it always had. Inside that dim garage, however, time seemed frozen. Charles carefully turned the Polaroid over. On the back, written in fading blue ink, were words Dorothy had never seen. "No one is forgotten while someone still shows up." She read the sentence twice. "What does it mean?" Charles smiled softly. "Samuel said it after every funeral." Dorothy looked puzzled. "He believed memory wasn't something you felt. It was something you practiced." Charles gently placed the photograph back inside its plastic sleeve. For 30 years I've tried. You visited him? Every Memorial Day. He looked ashamed. But after my health got worse, his voice faded. I couldn't drive anymore. Dorothy squeezed his shoulder. We'll go together. Charles shook his head. No. You don't have to carry that. I want to. He smiled. I know. Years continued passing. Charles grew weaker. Simple walks became exhausting. His medications multiplied. Some mornings he forgot ordinary conversations. Yet one thing never changed. Whenever Dorothy helped him organize the wooden box, he always checked the photograph first. Always. As if making sure Samuel still smiled back. One snowy December evening, while hospice equipment quietly filled their living room, Charles asked Dorothy to bring him the wooden box one final time. She already knew. The way people sometimes know rain is coming before clouds appear. He opened the box with trembling fingers. His breathing had become shallow. Dorothy. I'm here. I need one more promise. You already have all of them. He smiled faintly. No? This one has to outlive me. She leaned closer. Charles handed her the old Polaroid. I don't want him to be alone. Her eyes filled immediately. You hear me? I do. If you can. His breathing paused. Go sometimes. I will. If you can't go every year, I'll still go. If you can't bring flowers, I'll bring whatever I can. He smiled. If all you have, another pause, is yourself. She nodded through tears. I'll still show up. Charles gently closed her fingers around the photograph. That's enough. 3 days later, Charles Simpson passed away quietly before sunrise. In the weeks that followed, Dorothy buried him wearing the same navy suit he had worn to church every Easter. Most neighbors returned to their routines. Hospital bills continued arriving. Insurance covered less than expected. Within 18 months, Dorothy lost the house. Then her job, after taking extended leave during Charles's final illness. Eventually, she lost almost everything else, except the wooden box, the photograph, and one promise. Every morning since then, no matter how difficult life became, Dorothy had risen before dawn, because somewhere beneath a white marble headstone, a soldier still waited for someone to keep showing up. The notice appeared on a Monday morning, printed in bold black letters and taped beside the main entrance to Arlington National Cemetery. It was impossible to miss. New visitor. Access policy. Effective immediately. Public entry before 6:30 a.m. is prohibited. Authorized personnel only. Thank you for your cooperation. Dorothy read the notice twice, then a third time. The words didn't change. She lowered her eyes to the bouquet of white daisies she had gathered from behind Grace Turner's diner before sunrise. The flowers suddenly felt much heavier than they should have. For nearly 6 years she had arrived before dawn. Not because anyone had asked her to, because Charles had. She glanced toward the eastern sky. It was only 5:12. For the first time in years, the cemetery gates remained closed. Officer Brian Collins stepped outside the security office carrying a clipboard. He recognized Dorothy immediately. I'm sorry. She nodded politely. I saw the notice. Brian shifted uncomfortably. New policy. I understand. We have cameras now. I understand. We can't let anyone inside until opening. Dorothy looked beyond him toward the endless rows of white headstones barely visible beneath the morning mist. I'll only need 15 minutes. Brian sighed. I know. I've never caused trouble. I know. I clean one grave. I know. His repeated answers almost sounded apologetic, but the gate remained locked. Dorothy tightened her grip on the bucket. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, she asked quietly. What time did they say? 6:30. She looked toward her watch. By then, the first tour buses would already be arriving. Families, school groups, veterans. The peaceful silence Charles had treasured would already be gone. She had promised him dawn. Not daylight, not crowds. Dawn. Dorothy lowered her head. Thank you. Brian blinked. For what? For explaining. She turned to leave. Brian watched her walk away, expecting anger, an argument, perhaps tears. Instead, she simply disappeared down the sidewalk, carrying the same bucket she had brought every morning for years. Somehow, that made him feel worse. Inside the administration building, Harold Jenkins looked up from his paperwork. Did she come? Brian nodded. How'd she take it? She said thank you. Harold removed his reading glasses. That's all. Brian stared through the window. That's all. Harold leaned back heavily. I was afraid of that. What do you mean? People who yell usually recover quickly. He folded the policy memo. The quiet ones carry disappointment home. Brian said nothing, because deep down he knew Harold was right. Dorothy reached Grace Turner's diner almost an hour earlier than usual. Grace looked surprised. You forgot something. Dorothy placed the untouched flowers gently onto the counter. They changed the rules. Grace frowned. What rules? Dorothy explained quietly while pouring herself a cup of coffee she suddenly didn't feel like drinking. Grace listened without interrupting. When Dorothy finished, the older woman folded her arms. That's ridiculous. They're just doing their jobs. They're doing paperwork. Dorothy smiled faintly. They're protecting the cemetery. Grace shook her head. And who protects promises? The question lingered between them. Dorothy looked into the steam rising from her coffee. I told Charles I'd be there every morning. You still can. It won't be dawn anymore. Grace reached across the counter and covered Dorothy's hand. Charles loved you. Dorothy nodded. He wouldn't want one locked gate breaking your heart. I know. But promises have a strange way of keeping time. Grace understood. She had buried her husband 15 years earlier. There were dates that still lived inside her bones. No calendar required. Across the city, Isaiah Brooks arrived at the cemetery 15 minutes later than usual. The locked entrance immediately caught his attention. He noticed Dorothy standing outside the fence, speaking quietly with Officer Collins before walking away. She never raised her voice, never pointed a finger, never argued. Isaiah remained inside his vehicle until Dorothy disappeared. Then he stepped out. Brian recognized him immediately. Mr. Brooks. Isaiah nodded politely. What happened? Brian gestured toward the new notice. Policy change. Isaiah read it carefully. When did this begin? Today. Isaiah looked toward the sidewalk where Dorothy had vanished. The woman who comes every morning. Brian hesitated. We had to stop her. Did she protest? No. Isaiah almost seemed disappointed by the answer. No? Brian shook his head. She thanked me. Isaiah looked away for several seconds, then quietly asked, How long has she been coming here? Brian glanced toward Harold's office. I don't know exactly. Harold stepped outside after hearing the conversation. Almost 6 years. Isaiah turned. You've kept track. Harold nodded. The first few months I thought she might be sleeping here. And I followed her. Isaiah listened carefully. She cleaned exactly one grave. Every day. Every single day. Rain. Yes. Snow. Yes. Christmas morning. Harold smiled sadly. Especially Christmas morning. Isaiah stared toward his father's section of the cemetery. Something tightened inside his chest. Did she ever ask for anything? Harold shook his head. Not once. No money. No. No food. No. No special treatment. No. Isaiah lowered his eyes, then asked the question that had been growing inside him since the first morning. Do you know her name? Harold nodded. Dorothy Simpson. The name settled quietly into Isaiah's memory. Dorothy Simpson. For reasons he couldn't explain, it sounded familiar, not because he had heard it before, because somehow it already belonged beside his father's. That afternoon, Dorothy drove her aging minivan to the public library. Whenever life became too loud, libraries reminded her that silence could still be kind. She sat at the same table near the history shelves. The wooden box rested beside her. Carefully, she removed the Polaroid. The protective plastic had grown cloudy over the years. Small cracks stretched across one corner. She sighed softly. It won't last forever. She had been saving $1 at a time to replace the sleeve. Every week, something else demanded the money instead. Gasoline, medicine, laundry, life. She gently turned the photograph over. The faded blue handwriting remained visible. No one is forgotten while someone still shows up. Her thumb rested on the final word. Show up. Not rescue, not fix, not explain, simply arrive. Charles had repeated that lesson often. When people are hurting, ... He would smile gently. Half the healing comes from knowing someone came. Dorothy closed her eyes. I'm still coming. A librarian passed quietly without disturbing her. Outside, children laughed as they crossed the street toward an ice cream shop. Inside, Dorothy carefully wrapped the photograph again. She wasn't worried about herself. She could survive another difficult season. She had survived worse. What frightened her was the possibility that one morning might become the first morning she failed to keep her promise. Late that evening, Isaiah sat alone in his home office. The lights remained off. Only the desk lamp illuminated the old military photograph he had removed from a storage box earlier that afternoon. His mother had written one sentence on the back decades before. Your father believed gratitude was something you practiced, not something you announced. Isaiah stared at the handwriting. Then remembered Dorothy kneeling quietly before dawn. Practicing gratitude, not announcing it. He reached for his phone. His finger hovered above Emily Carter's contact for several seconds. Finally, he called. She answered almost immediately. Everything okay? I need a favor. What kind? I want you to find out everything you legally can about Dorothy Simpson. Emily waited. No publicity. None. No investigators following her. No. No media. Absolutely not. What exactly are we looking for? Isaiah looked once more at the photograph of his father. I don't know yet. He paused. But people don't spend 6 years honoring strangers without carrying an extraordinary story. Outside his window, the Washington skyline shimmered beneath the evening lights. Across the city, Dorothy carefully folded her blanket inside the old minivan. She set her alarm for 4:15 anyway, even though she already knew she wouldn't be allowed inside the cemetery before sunrise. Some promises she believed began long before anyone opened the gate. The next morning, Isaiah Brooks woke at 4:30 without the sound of an alarm. For a few moments he remained lying in bed, staring at the ceiling of the quiet Georgetown townhouse that had become more museum than home over the years. The walls displayed photographs from business milestones. Awards lined polished shelves. Paintings collected from charity auctions filled the hallways. Yet not a single room carried the warmth of everyday life. No children's drawings. No family vacations framed above the fireplace. No lingering smell of breakfast. Just silence. He dressed simply that morning. Dark jeans, a charcoal sweater, an old brown leather jacket that had belonged to his father. The sleeves were slightly too short, but Isaiah wore it every time he visited Arlington. Not because it fit, because it reminded him of a man he barely had the chance to know. As he drove toward the cemetery, dawn had not yet broken. The roads were unusually empty. His thoughts, however, were crowded. Dorothy Simpson. The name had settled into his mind like a song he couldn't stop hearing. He had met thousands of people throughout his career. Presidents, generals, celebrities, investors. Yet one homeless woman who never spoke to him occupied more of his thoughts than any of them. He pulled into the cemetery parking lot at exactly 5:55. The new policy meant visitors would have to wait another 35 minutes. He noticed Dorothy immediately. She sat alone on a weathered wooden bench across the street from the entrance. Her bucket rested beside her feet. The same bouquet of fresh flowers lay carefully wrapped in damp paper. She wasn't complaining. She wasn't pacing. She simply waited. Isaiah chose a parking space far enough away that she wouldn't notice him. For nearly 20 minutes, he quietly observed. At precisely 6:10, Dorothy stood. She walked toward the entrance not to argue with the guards, but to sweep several handfuls of litter that had collected near the public sidewalk. Fast food wrappers, plastic bottles, a crushed soda can. Nobody had asked her to clean that area. She simply couldn't bear walking past trash without picking it up. Officer Brian Collins stepped outside. "You don't have to do that." Dorothy smiled. "I know. That's city property." "I know." Brian scratched the back of his neck. "You really don't have to." Dorothy dropped another bottle into the trash bag. "I was already standing here." Brian almost smiled. For the first time since meeting her, he noticed something unusual. She never acted as though the world owed her kindness. She simply offered it first. Isaiah noticed the exchange, too. He rolled his window down slightly. Neither Dorothy nor Brian knew they were being watched. Brian cleared his throat. "I talked to Mr. Jenkins yesterday." Dorothy looked up. "He told me you've been coming here a long time." She nodded. "A little while." "Almost 6 years isn't a little while." Dorothy smiled softly. "I suppose not." Brian hesitated before asking, "Why didn't you ever tell us why you come?" Dorothy looked toward the cemetery gate. "I didn't think the reason belonged to me." "What do you mean?" "The promise was between my husband and someone else." Brian frowned. "So you kept it anyway?" She nodded once. "I married his promises, too." Brian had no reply. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, he said quietly, "I'm sorry about yesterday." Dorothy looked genuinely surprised. "You don't owe me an apology. I still feel like I do." She shook her head. "You were doing your job." "But my husband used to tell me something." Brian waited. "Don't make another person carry the weight of a decision they didn't make." She smiled kindly. "You didn't write the policy." Brian looked away. Somehow her forgiveness hurt more than anger would have. Across the parking lot, Isaiah sat perfectly still. That sentence lingered inside him. Don't make another person carry the weight of a decision they didn't make. How many employees had silently carried decisions made in his boardroom? How many ordinary people had paid the price for policies created by executives who never met them? The thought unsettled him. At exactly 6:30, the electronic gate slid open. Dorothy thanked Brian with a gentle nod before walking inside. She didn't hurry, even though she had already lost more than an hour. Isaiah followed several minutes later, careful to keep his distance. Families had begun entering the cemetery now. The peaceful stillness Dorothy cherished had disappeared. Children whispered. Tour guides gathered small groups. Maintenance vehicles moved slowly along the paved roads. Isaiah watched Dorothy reach Captain Samuel Brooks's grave. She paused. The surrounding area remained clean from the previous morning. Even so, she knelt. She brushed away tiny pine needles that most visitors wouldn't even notice. She wiped invisible fingerprints from the marble. straightened the flag, replaced the flowers. Then she simply sat. She wasn't cleaning anymore. She was keeping company. Isaiah had never considered that possibility before. Most people visited graves to remember. Dorothy behaved as though someone was still present. Not physically, but faithfully. As if loneliness itself deserved company. An elderly veteran using a cane slowly approached the neighboring grave. He lost his balance while stepping off the path. Before Isaiah could move, Dorothy was already beside him. "Easy now?" The old man smiled awkwardly. "Guess my knees forgot they're 78. Dorothy steadied him without making him feel fragile. "No rush. I hate needing help. So did my husband." The veteran chuckled. Then he must have been Army. He was. So was I. They shared a brief smile. After the veteran reached the neighboring headstone safely, he reached into his pocket. "Please." He held out a folded $20 bill. "For helping." Dorothy gently pushed his hand back toward him. "No, thank you." "I insist." "So do I." "You could use it." She looked him in the eye. "I helped because you needed a hand. Not because I needed $20. The old veteran slowly lowered his wallet. "You remind me of someone." Dorothy smiled. "I hope that's a compliment." "It is." He tipped his old military cap before walking away. Isaiah watched every second. There had been no performance, no audience, no opportunity for recognition, just instinctive kindness. His phone vibrated. Emily Carter. He answered quietly. "Morning." "I found a little information." Isaiah stepped farther down the path. "What did you learn?" Dorothy Simpson worked as a CNA for nearly 2 decades. He wasn't surprised. She lost her nursing certification after taking extended leave while caring for her terminally ill husband. Isaiah closed his eyes. Emily continued. "The house was foreclosed about 5 years ago. No criminal record. No substance abuse history. No outstanding warrants. Anything else?" Emily hesitated. "She volunteers." Isaiah frowned. "Volunteers?" "Twice a month." "Where?" "A veteran's soup kitchen." He almost laughed in disbelief. "A homeless woman volunteers. According to the director, she washes dishes after everyone else eats." Isaiah looked toward Dorothy. She had resumed quietly polishing the headstone. "Does anyone know she was homeless?" "The director told me they figured it out months after she started. And they offered to move her to the front of the meal line." Isaiah waited. Emily smiled softly through the phone. "She refused." "What did she say?" Emily glanced down at her notes. "She said," her voice became quieter, "the men who served should eat first. I can wait." Isaiah slowly lowered his head. He had spent millions funding veterans' charities. Dorothy had been feeding veterans while wondering where she herself would sleep. For the first time in years, Isaiah felt embarrassed by how easily generosity had come to him. Money had always been his language. Dorothy spoke another one entirely. As he ended the call, he looked once more toward his father's grave. Dorothy had finished cleaning. She removed the old Polaroid from its protective sleeve, held it gently against the marble, closed her eyes, and whispered the familiar words. "No one is forgotten while someone still shows up." Isaiah couldn't hear the sentence, but he could see her lips moving. He realized then that whatever promise had brought Dorothy here each morning was far greater than curiosity. It was shaping everyone who witnessed it, including him. 3 days later, the weather changed without warning. Dark clouds rolled across northern Virginia before sunrise, swallowing the first light that Dorothy loved so much. By the time she parked her aging minivan outside the cemetery, rain was already tapping steadily against the windshield. She looked through the glass toward the entrance. Even from a distance, the white marble headstone seemed to disappear beneath a curtain of gray. Dorothy smiled faintly. "I'll still come." Charles had once joked that rain only meant the sky was helping wash the world. She stepped out into the cold drizzle, pulling the hood of her faded gray coat over her head. Her bucket was lighter than usual. She had wrapped everything inside plastic bags the night before. The flowers, the towel, the cleaning brush. Most importantly, the old Polaroid. She checked the zip-top bag once more before walking. "Stay dry," she whispered to it. At 6:30, the gates opened. Only a handful of visitors entered that morning. Most people chose to stay home when rain covered the city. Dorothy quietly made her way toward Captain Samuel Brooks's grave. Water already pooled in the grass surrounding the marble stone. She knelt without hesitation. The knees of her jeans immediately soaked through. She didn't seem to notice. Rain slid down her sleeves while she gently wiped away wet leaves plastered against the headstone. The marble no longer needed dusting. Nature had done that herself. Instead, Dorothy carefully cleared away mud collecting near the base. She straightened the tiny American flag after a strong gust bent it sideways. Then she placed the fresh flowers into the bronze vase. The white daisies trembled in the wind. "So do we," she whispered. "But we stay." She reached inside her coat. The familiar plastic sleeve emerged. Something immediately felt wrong. The tape sealing one corner had begun peeling away. Water had found its way inside. Dorothy's heart skipped. "No." She quickly opened the protective bag. A small drop of water rested on the faded photograph. Another gust of wind hit without warning. The loose plastic slipped from her fingers. The Polaroid tumbled across the wet marble, then onto the soaked grass. Dorothy lunged forward, but the wind caught it again. The photograph skidded several feet across the rain-covered pathway. No. She scrambled after it, her bucket tipping over beside the grave. The towel, the brush, the flowers she hadn't yet arranged. Everything scattered across the wet ground. Just as another gust threatened to carry the photograph farther down the path, a polished black leather shoe stepped gently onto one corner. Not crushing it, only stopping it from blowing away. Dorothy looked up. Isaiah Brooks slowly bent down. Without speaking, he carefully lifted the photograph between two fingers. He immediately noticed how fragile it was. The edges had become almost paper-thin. The protective sleeve was patched together with layers of aging, transparent tape. He held it as though it were priceless, because somehow he already suspected it was. Dorothy hurried toward him. "I'm so sorry." Isaiah looked surprised. "For what?" "I made a mess." He glanced toward the scattered cleaning supplies. Rain continued falling around them. "I think the weather deserves the blame." She almost smiled. Almost. Isaiah extended the photograph. "I was careful." "I know." She accepted it with both hands. For a long moment, she simply stared at the damp corner where water had begun soaking into the image. Her shoulders lowered slightly. Years of careful protection had nearly disappeared in seconds. Isaiah quietly removed a neatly folded white handkerchief from his jacket pocket. "It's clean." Dorothy hesitated. "I couldn't." "You can dry the outside." She accepted it reluctantly. "Thank you." Together, without discussing it, they began gathering the items scattered around the pathway. Isaiah picked up the brush. Dorothy collected the bucket. He retrieved the fallen flowers. She found the towel lying in the wet grass. The entire time, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt respectful. When everything had been placed back inside the bucket, Dorothy carefully dabbed the outside of the plastic sleeve with Isaiah's handkerchief. She smiled sadly. "I think this sleeve has reached the end." Isaiah looked at the old tape. "How long have you had it?" She thought for a moment. "Maybe 15 years?" You've repaired it many times, as long as I could. Another drop of rain landed on the photograph. Dorothy quickly tucked it beneath her coat. Isaiah glanced toward Captain Samuel Brooks's grave. You come every day? She looked at him carefully for the first time. She recognized his face, not from newspapers, from the black SUV. You've been here before? Isaiah smiled faintly. A few mornings. I thought so. You noticed. I notice people. Another brief silence settled between them. Finally, Isaiah spoke. My name is Isaiah. She nodded politely. I'm Dorothy. It's nice to finally meet you. You too. Rain continued falling softly around them. Isaiah looked toward the freshly cleaned headstone. You take very good care of this place. Dorothy followed his gaze. It deserves to be cared for. You knew Captain Brooks. She lowered her eyes. I knew someone who did. Isaiah didn't press further. Instead, he asked, was he family? No. A friend. She considered the question. The best kind. Isaiah sensed there was more, much more, yet he also sensed she wasn't avoiding the truth. She simply wasn't ready to unfold it. He respected that. You've been coming here a long time. She smiled gently. Long enough to know where every tree loses its leaves first. Isaiah laughed quietly. And she pointed toward a large oak several rows away. That one starts almost 2 weeks before the others. He looked where she pointed. I never noticed. Most people don't. She said it without judgment, only as fact. Isaiah realized she probably knew this cemetery better than many employees. Not because she worked there, because she paid attention. A strong gust shook rainwater from the oak branches overhead. Isaiah instinctively stepped closer, shielding Dorothy and the bucket from the falling spray. She looked surprised. Thank you. My father always said umbrellas should be shared. You brought one, he smiled. No. She laughed softly. The sound caught him off guard. It transformed her face completely. For just a second, the exhaustion disappeared. He could almost imagine the younger woman she must once have been. Dorothy carefully folded the now damp handkerchief. I should wash this before returning it. Isaiah shook his head. Keep it. I couldn't. I have others. She still hesitated. My husband hated wasting good things. Isaiah smiled. My father did too. Their eyes met. Something unspoken passed quietly between them. Not recognition. Not yet. Only familiarity. Two strangers carrying memories that still shaped every ordinary morning. Isaiah glanced once more at the worn plastic sleeve. I know someone who restores old photographs. Dorothy immediately shook her head. It's all right. It wouldn't cost... She gently interrupted. I appreciate the offer. But... I made a promise. He waited. I think promises should be carried by the people who made them. Isaiah looked confused. She explained softly. If someone else starts carrying all my burdens. She smiled kindly. Tandarikwer. Eventually they become theirs, instead of mine. Isaiah remembered another sentence she'd spoken days earlier to Officer Collins. Don't make another person carry the weight of a decision they didn't make. Now another lesson appeared. She lived exactly as she spoke. He nodded slowly. I understand. Whether he truly did remained uncertain. But he respected the answer. Dorothy carefully placed the repaired photograph back inside her coat. Then she looked toward Captain Brooks's grave. I should finish. Isaiah stepped back. Of course. She knelt once more before the marble. Isaiah quietly watched from several yards away. Dorothy rested 2 fingers against the stone. Not dramatically, simply as someone greeting an old friend. After a moment, she stood, lifted her bucket, and turned to leave. Halfway down the pathway, she stopped, walked back, and held out the freshly folded handkerchief. I changed my mind. Isaiah looked puzzled. She smiled. I'll borrow it. He accepted it, and return it, when I no longer need it. Isaiah nodded. I'll look forward to that. Dorothy walked away through the rain. Isaiah remained standing before his father's grave long after she disappeared. For the first time since he was a child, he found himself speaking aloud to the man beneath the marble. Dad. He looked down at the carefully polished name. Who is she? The rain offered no answer, only the quiet certainty that this story had just begun. The damaged corner of the old Polaroid stayed in Isaiah Brooks's thoughts long after the rain had ended. It wasn't merely an old photograph, it was evidence that someone had guarded a memory for decades despite losing almost everything else. People protected what they valued. Dorothy had protected that photograph with layers of cracked plastic fading tape and extraordinary care. Isaiah wanted to understand why, but understanding, he reminded himself, required patience, not assumptions. 2 mornings later, he asked Emily Carter to clear his afternoon schedule. No meetings after lunch. She looked up from her tablet. Everything. You've been waiting 3 months for the Defense Technology Committee. They'll survive another week. Emily smiled. I assume this has something to do with Dorothy Simpson? Isaiah almost smiled back. You know me too well. I've worked for you 11 years. She closed the tablet. Where are we going? National Archives first? Emily blinked. The archives. I want military records. On your father. And anyone connected to him. She didn't ask another question. She simply picked up her notebook. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, they sat inside a quiet research room where military service records could be requested through authorized channels. An elderly archivist named Robert Henderson greeted Isaiah politely. What can I help you find today? Isaiah slid a small card across the desk. Captain Samuel Brooks. Robert typed for several moments. I see his file. Isaiah waited. I'm also looking for soldiers assigned to the same unit. Robert adjusted his glasses. Do you have another name? Isaiah hesitated. No. Robert looked apologetic. Hesitated. No. Robert looked apologetic. That may take some time. I have time. The archivist smiled. Most people don't. Over the next hour, service records gradually appeared. Training locations, deployment dates, unit assignments, commendations, medical reports. Isaiah had seen portions of his father's military history before, but never in such detail. He discovered things his mother had never spoken about. Samuel Brooks had received 2 commendation medals before the mission that claimed his life. He had repeatedly volunteered for rescue operations considered too dangerous by other officers. One evaluation described him using only a single sentence, displays unusual concern for the safety of fellow soldiers. Isaiah read the sentence 3 times. It sounded strangely familiar. He wondered if character could somehow echo across generations. Robert returned, carrying another folder. I found several soldiers assigned to the same operation. Isaiah leaned forward. Robert slowly opened the file. One name appears repeatedly alongside Captain Brooks. Isaiah looked down. Charles William Simpson. The room became completely silent. Emily looked from the document to Isaiah. Simpson. Isaiah nodded slowly. Dorothy's husband. Robert continued reading. Sergeant Charles Simpson. Decorated. Medically retired. Survived the incident that resulted in Captain Brooks's death. Isaiah's heartbeat quickened. So they served together. Robert nodded. More than that. He pointed toward an after-action report. According to this, he adjusted his glasses again. Sue. Captain Brooks re-entered active fire after Sergeant Simpson became trapped. Emily quietly covered her mouth. Robert continued. Captain Brooks successfully reached Sergeant Simpson. He pushed him toward the evacuation helicopter. Isaiah already knew what came next before hearing it. Captain Brooks remained behind. The room fell silent again. Isaiah stared at the faded military report. Everything suddenly began connecting. Charles Simpson, Dorothy Simpson. The old photograph. 6 years of cleaning one grave. The promise. Robert turned another page. This is unusual? What is? A personal recommendation. Isaiah leaned closer. Signed by the commanding officer. It read, Sergeant Charles Simpson repeatedly requested that Captain Brooks receive the highest available recognition. He maintains that his own survival is solely due to Captain Brooks's actions. Isaiah slowly exhaled. His father had saved Charles. Charles had spent the rest of his life remembering. Dorothy had inherited that remembrance. Emily whispered softly, My goodness. Robert closed the file respectfully. There are stories, history records. He gently rested one hand atop the folder. And stories families carry. This one appears to be both. On the drive back to Washington, neither Isaiah nor Emily spoke for nearly 20 minutes. Traffic moved slowly across Memorial Bridge. Finally, Emily broke the silence. So Dorothy never knew your father personally? No. But Charles did. Isaiah nodded. He owed his life to mine. Emily looked out the window. And Dorothy kept the promise after Charles died. Isaiah stared ahead. Without ever contacting us? Emily frowned thoughtfully. Wouldn't most people have? Probably. She could have asked for help. She never did. Isaiah realized something else. Not once had Dorothy mentioned hardship. Not once had she used Charles's service to gain sympathy. Not once had she introduced herself as the widow of the man Captain Brooks had saved. She had simply continued showing up. That realization humbled him more deeply than any biography ever could. Meanwhile, Dorothy finished another shift washing dishes at the veteran soup kitchen. Steam filled the small kitchen as volunteers prepared trays for the next day's lunch service. A younger volunteer named Marcus watched her scrub oversized cooking pots. You always stay late. Dorothy smiled. They're easier to wash before everything dries. Marcus hesitated. Can I ask something? Of course. Why don't you ever let anyone help? She laughed softly. I let people help all the time. I've never seen it. She rinsed another pot. That's because helping isn't always carrying the heavy end. Marcus looked puzzled. What do you mean? Dorothy handed him a towel. You drying these? He nodded. See? She smiled. Now we're helping each other. Marcus laughed. You have an answer for everything. No. I've just lived long enough to stop asking the wrong questions. He thought about that for a moment. What are the wrong questions? Dorothy placed another clean pot onto the shelf. Questions like, she smiled gently. Why me? Marcus waited. I've learned better ones. Such as, what can I still do today? Marcus nodded slowly. He understood why every veteran who came through the kitchen seemed to know Dorothy's name. Not because she talked the most, because she listened the longest. That evening, Isaiah returned alone to his father's grave. The cemetery had nearly emptied. Golden sunlight stretched across the white marble rows. He carried no flowers, only the copied military report folded inside his jacket. He stood quietly before the headstone. "Dad," his voice sounded strangely small in the open air. "I found Charles Simpson." A breeze moved gently through the trees. Isaiah unfolded the report. He never forgot. His eyes drifted toward the surrounding graves. Neither did Dorothy. For the first time in decades, Isaiah no longer imagined his father lying alone beneath the marble. Someone had been visiting, praying, cleaning, remembering, every single morning. He suddenly realized something else. His father hadn't been forgotten because of Isaiah. He had been remembered because of Charles, and after Charles, because of Dorothy. The weight of that truth settled gently over him, not as guilt, as gratitude. He folded the port again. "I think," he smiled faintly towards the engraved name, "you chose your friends well." As he turned to leave, Harold Jenkins approached, carrying a maintenance clipboard. "Evening, Mr. Brooks." "Good evening." Harold noticed the thoughtful expression on Isaiah's face. "You learned something." Isaiah nodded. "I learned her husband served with my father." Harold stopped walking. "So that's it?" Isaiah looked surprised. "You suspected—" Harold smiled. "I've watched Dorothy for almost 6 years." "You begin noticing patterns." "What kind?" "The kind that only grief and love can create." Isaiah looked back towards the grave. "I'm beginning to notice them, too." Harold nodded slowly. "Just remember one thing." Isaiah waited. "Some stories aren't improved by rescuing the person living them. They're honored by understanding them first." Isaiah quietly absorbed the advice. He knew Harold was right. He could solve many of Dorothy's practical problems with a single signature. But dignity could not be donated. Trust had to be earned. And some promises deserved to be understood before they were interrupted. As the sun disappeared beyond the trees, Isaiah made a silent decision. He would not rush into Dorothy's life as a billionaire. He would first learn to see her the way Charles, and perhaps even his own father, would have seen her, not as someone to save, but as someone already living an extraordinary life. The following Saturday began with unusually clear skies. After nearly a week of rain, Arlington National Cemetery seemed almost transformed. Morning sunlight reflected softly across rows of white marble, and the damp grass shimmered beneath the early light. Dorothy arrived carrying something new. Not flowers, not cleaning supplies. A small brown paper envelope. She slipped it carefully into the bucket before entering through the now familiar 6:30 opening. Officer Brian Collins noticed her immediately. "Good morning," she smiled. "It certainly is." He glanced toward the clear sky. "Best weather we've had all week." "It feels like someone finally remembered to open the curtains," Brian laughed. "You always say things differently." Dorothy shrugged. "I've had a lot of mornings to practice." As she walked away, Brian found himself smiling. It had become impossible to think of Dorothy as simply another visitor. She had quietly become part of the cemetery itself, like the old oak trees or the morning birds. She belonged. Across another section of the cemetery, Isaiah stood beside his father's grave several rows away, deliberately arriving before Dorothy reached Captain Samuel Brooks's headstone. He wasn't hiding anymore, but he also wasn't intruding. He simply wanted to witness what had become part of his own mourning. Dorothy arrived a few minutes later. She greeted him with a small nod. "Good morning, Isaiah." "Good morning, Dorothy." No awkwardness remained between them, only calm familiarity. Isaiah noticed she carried the small envelope. "Something special today?" She smiled. "A little." She knelt before the grave, as always, cleaned away several fallen leaves, straightened the small American flag. Then, instead of immediately placing flowers into the bronze vase, she carefully opened the envelope. Inside rested several faded newspaper clippings. Isaiah remained where he stood. He didn't step closer. Dorothy noticed his curiosity. "It's all right?" She motioned gently. "You can come." Isaiah approached slowly. The newspaper pieces had yellowed with age. Some headlines were barely readable. Dorothy carefully unfolded the largest one. It showed a photograph of several returning soldiers decades earlier. The print quality was poor. Faces were difficult to distinguish. "My husband kept these." Isaiah looked closely. "Is Captain Brooks here?" Dorothy pointed toward a smiling young man near the center. "There." Isaiah felt something catch in his throat. He had never seen that photograph before. Samuel Brooks looked impossibly young. Not a soldier remembered through history. Simply a man laughing beside friends. Dorothy placed another clipping beside it. "This one mentions the rescue." Isaiah leaned closer. Most of the article had faded. Only scattered sentences remained readable. "Heroic action. Returned under heavy fire. Saved fellow soldier. Did not survive." Isaiah swallowed quietly. "My mother never showed me these." Dorothy smiled gently. "Charles read them many times." She paused. Then he stopped. "Why?" "He said newspapers always tell you what happened." She carefully folded one corner. "But they never tell you what someone was like." Isaiah nodded slowly. His father had become a military citation, a medal, a name engraved in stone. Dorothy had somehow preserved the human being behind all of it. She reached into the envelope one final time. There was only one item left. A small Christmas card. Its edges had become worn with age. The front displayed a simple painted church beneath falling snow. Inside, written in careful handwriting, were only 2 sentences. "Samuel, still grateful, you're impossible to forget. See you Christmas morning." Charles Isaiah stared silently. "There wasn't a year," Dorothy said softly, "that Charles didn't write one." "He mailed them," she shook her head. "No. He brought them here." Isaiah looked at the grave. "Every Christmas. Until he couldn't?" His eyes slowly filled. "So after he died?" Dorothy smiled. I continued. For several long moments, neither of them spoke. The cemetery around them remained peaceful. Somewhere in the distance, birds called from the trees. Isaiah finally asked the question that had quietly lived inside him. "Why didn't Charles ever contact my family?" Dorothy looked toward the engraved name. "He almost did." Isaiah waited. "Many times." "What stopped him?" She thought carefully before answering. "He said gratitude shouldn't become another person's burden." Isaiah frowned slightly. "I don't understand." Dorothy folded the old Christmas card. "He worried your mother had already lost enough. He didn't want her to feel responsible for comforting him." She smiled sadly. "He believed remembering Samuel was his responsibility, not hers." Isaiah lowered his eyes. It sounded exactly like something Dorothy herself would believe. She carefully returned every clipping to the envelope. "Charles wasn't trying to repay a debt. He was trying to honor a friend." That afternoon, Isaiah drove to his mother's former home. The house had remained empty since her passing 2 years earlier. He rarely visited. Too many unopened boxes still waited inside. Dust covered most of the furniture. The familiar scent of cedar and old books greeted him as he unlocked the front door. He walked directly to the attic. For hours he searched through military keepsakes, photo albums, letters, storage boxes. Finally, beneath a folded army blanket, he found a weathered cardboard box labeled simply Sam. Inside lay dozens of letters. Most came from fellow soldiers, families, former commanding officers. Isaiah carefully sorted through them. Then one envelope caught his attention. It had never been opened. The handwriting across the front read, "Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, from Charles Simpson." The postmark was dated nearly 25 years earlier. Isaiah stared in disbelief. Charles had written. His mother had never opened it. Perhaps it had arrived after she became ill. Perhaps it had slipped beneath other mail. Perhaps she had simply overlooked it. No one would ever know. His hands trembled as he carefully opened the envelope. Inside rested only a single page. "Mrs. Brooks, you don't know me, but I owe every tomorrow I have to your husband. There isn't a day I don't remember what he did. I wanted you to know that Samuel wasn't only brave, he was kind. Men followed him because he noticed people everyone else overlooked. He made us laugh when we had forgotten laughter. He shared food when his own portions were smaller. He believed no one should be left behind. I've tried to live the rest of my life in a way that would make him proud. I hope I've succeeded. Thank you for sharing him with the rest of us. With deepest gratitude, Sergeant Charles Simpson." Isaiah slowly lowered the letter. His eyes blurred. The room became very quiet. All these years, his mother had never known. Charles had kept his promise anyway, without expecting recognition, without waiting for thanks. Isaiah carefully folded the letter again. He understood now why Dorothy never tried to introduce herself. Neither she nor Charles had ever sought acknowledgement. Memory itself had been enough. The following morning, Isaiah returned to Arlington carrying the unopened Christmas card Charles had left at Samuel's grave years earlier. Dorothy was already there. She looked up as he approached. "You found something." He nodded. "I found a letter." She quietly waited. Isaiah handed it to her. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Charles. Her fingers gently touched the paper. "I wondered where this had gone." "He mailed it." She smiled sadly. "He always said maybe one day." Isaiah looked toward his father's grave. "I think that day just arrived." Dorothy carefully returned the letter. "It belongs with your family now." Isaiah shook his head. "It belongs to both." For the first time since they met, Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. Not because something had been returned, because after so many years, Charles's gratitude had finally reached the people it was always meant to find. Neither of them noticed Harold Jenkins quietly watching from a respectful distance. The old cemetery manager smiled to himself. Some promises took decades to complete. But when they finally did, they often healed far more people than those who first made them. Isaiah Brooks spent the next week doing something he had not done in years. He waited. Not for quarterly earnings, not for a board vote, not for a government contract. He waited for certainty. Every morning he continued visiting Arlington. Every morning Dorothy arrived with the same quiet determination. Nothing about her routine changed after Charles's letter had finally reached Isaiah's hands. She never asked what he intended to do with it. She never hinted that she needed anything. If anything, she seemed relieved, simply knowing the letter had found its destination. Isaiah realized that gratitude for Dorothy had never been a transaction. It had always been an ending, not the beginning of a request. Still, each passing day strengthened a conviction inside him. He could not continue pretending their lives had merely crossed by chance. His father had given Charles a future. Charles had honored Samuel. Dorothy had honored both men. Now the responsibility belonged to him, not to repay, to continue. On Thursday afternoon, Isaiah invited Emily Carter into his office. She entered carrying a stack of contracts. "You finally want these signed?" Isaiah smiled. "They can wait another hour." Emily raised an eyebrow. "That's unlike you." "I've been learning." She sat down. "I'm listening." Isaiah looked out the window toward the Washington skyline. "You remember what Harold told me? Some stories aren't improved by rescuing the person living them." Isaiah nodded. He was right. Emily waited. I don't want to rescue Dorothy. What do you want? Isaiah thought carefully before answering. I want to give her an opportunity she can choose. Emily smiled faintly. That's different. It has to be. He opened a folder already resting on his desk. Inside were photographs of a new Veterans Outreach Center his foundation had nearly completed. The building would provide counseling, employment assistance, and family support for former service members. One position remained unfilled, community care coordinator. Isaiah slid the folder toward Emily. I think I've found the right person. Emily looked through the documents. She doesn't have recent work history. I know. She hasn't held a professional position in years. I know. Her nursing certification expired. I know. Emily closed the folder. So why her? Isaiah smiled. Because no resume in the country can teach what she's already spent 6 years practicing. Emily nodded slowly. Showing up? Exactly. That evening, Isaiah visited Grace Turner's diner. The small restaurant buzzed with its usual dinner crowd. Coffee cups clinked against saucers. Conversations floated through the room. Grace immediately recognized him. You must be the gentleman from the cemetery. Isaiah smiled. I suppose word travels. It doesn't have far to go. She poured him coffee without asking. What can I do for you? I'm here about Dorothy. Grace leaned against the counter. I figured. Isaiah hesitated. I wanted to ask your advice. Grace laughed softly. That's a first? For me? For billionaires. Isaiah accepted the gentle joke. I don't want to insult her. Grace's expression softened. Good. Because she has more pride than people realize. I've noticed. Grace stirred another customer's tea before continuing. If you hand Dorothy money, she'll refuse. If you pity her, she'll disappear. If you make her feel like a charity project, you'll never see her again. Isaiah nodded. What if I offer her work? Grace looked carefully at him. Real work. Meaningful work. Not invented just to help. No. Grace studied his face for several seconds. Finally, she smiled. Then maybe. She leaned closer. But don't hire Dorothy because she needs saving. Isaiah waited. Hire her because everyone else needs someone like her. The sentence stayed with him long after he left the diner. The following morning, Dorothy arrived at Arlington carrying fresh white lilies. Isaiah was already waiting near Samuel Brooks's grave. She smiled. You're early. So are you. I usually am. I know. She arranged the flowers before speaking again. Everything all right? Isaiah took a slow breath. I've been hoping to ask you something. She looked up. What is it? There won't be enough time before the cemetery opens. She looked confused. I'm sorry. I was wondering. He paused. If you'd have breakfast with me after you're finished. Dorothy blinked. Breakfast? At Grace's diner. She laughed quietly. I already eat there. So I've learned. She looked at him thoughtfully. This isn't about the cemetery, is it? No. My husband. In a way. She gently wiped a small spot from the marble. And if I say no, Isaiah smiled. Then I'll wish you a good day. No pressure, no persuasion, just an invitation. Dorothy appreciated that. All right. I'll have a breakfast. An hour later, they sat in the corner booth of Grace's diner. Grace silently placed 2 plates of pancakes on the table before either of them ordered. I know what you both eat. She winked before walking away. Dorothy laughed. Grace believes menus are optional. Isaiah smiled. I think she's probably right. For several minutes, they spoke about ordinary things: the weather, the cemetery, the old oak tree that always lost its leaves first. Only after coffee had been poured did Isaiah finally speak. "Dorothy." She looked up. "I've learned a great deal about Charles." She nodded quietly. "So have I." He smiled. "What do you mean?" "I've been remembering things I forgot." She looked out the window. Funny how sharing memories wakes up others. Isaiah reached into his briefcase. He removed a simple folder. No gold logo, no elaborate presentation. He slid it across the table. "I'd like you to look at something." Dorothy opened it carefully. The first page described the Veterans Outreach Center. The second outlined the position Community Care Coordinator. Responsibilities included welcoming veterans, organizing support groups, coordinating volunteers, and visiting isolated former service members. Salary, health insurance, paid vacation, retirement plan. Dorothy stared silently at the pages. Finally, she looked up. "I think you've handed me the wrong folder." Isaiah smiled. "I haven't." She slowly pushed it back toward him. "I'm not qualified." "I disagree." "I haven't worked in years." "You've worked every day." She shook her head. "Not like this." Isaiah leaned forward. "Dorothy, you've cared for veterans without being asked. You've comforted strangers. You've served meals while wondering where your own would come from. You've kept a promise longer than many people keep careers." He paused. "The job description sounds like it was written about you." Dorothy lowered her eyes. "I don't have impressive credentials anymore." Isaiah answered gently. "You have something harder to find." She waited. "People trust you after 5 minutes." Silence settled over the booth. Grace quietly walked past, but deliberately pretended not to notice. Dorothy looked again at the folder. "I think—" She stopped. "What?" "I think you're offering this because you feel indebted." Isaiah immediately shook his head. "No." She searched his face. "My father saved Charles." "Yes." "And Charles changed your life." "Yes." "But that's not why." He spoke slowly, making certain every word was true. "If Charles had never met my father, if I'd never learned your name, if we had interviewed 100 people, I would still choose the woman who has already spent 6 years doing this work for free." Dorothy looked at him for a long time. He did not look away. Finally, she asked the one question he had hoped she would. "If I accept—" She rested one hand on the folder. "Can I still visit Samuel every morning?" Isaiah smiled. "The building doesn't open until 9. For the first time since Charles died, Dorothy allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't measured one difficult day at a time. She wasn't ready to say yes. But for the first time in many years, she also wasn't ready to say no. Dorothy carried the folder home. Home for the past 4 years had been the old blue minivan parked behind Grace Turner's diner, with permission from the owner. The vehicle was clean, carefully organized. A folded blanket occupied one side. Plastic storage bins held neatly stacked clothes. Charles's wooden keepsake box rested beneath the passenger seat. Nothing inside suggested comfort. Everything suggested dignity. She placed the folder beside the wooden box. For nearly an hour, she simply looked at it, not opening it again, not closing it away, just looking. Finally, she whispered into the quiet space. "What would you think, Charles?" There was no answer, only memories. She remembered the day she accepted her very first nursing assistant position. She had been terrified. Charles had laughed. "If you're scared—" He had squeezed her hand. "It probably means you care enough to do it well." She smiled at the memory. then looked back at the folder. Maybe she wasn't afraid of the job. Maybe she was afraid of believing life could become different. Hope, she had learned, was sometimes harder to carry than disappointment. Disappointment became familiar. Hope demanded courage. The next morning she arrived at Arlington before sunrise, as always. Officer Brian Collins noticed something different immediately. She seemed thoughtful, not sad, simply quieter than usual. "Everything okay?" Dorothy smiled. "I've been given something to think about." Brian nodded. "Those are usually the important things." She laughed softly. "They usually are." When the gates opened, she walked toward Samuel Brooks's grave. Isaiah wasn't there. She found herself almost looking for him. The realization surprised her. She hadn't expected his quiet presence to become part of her routine. After cleaning the grave, she sat beside it, as she often did. The morning breeze gently moved the tops of the nearby trees. She rested one hand against the cool marble. "I don't know what to do." She smiled faintly. "I suppose that's why people talk to headstones." An elderly groundskeeper trimming shrubs nearby pretended not to hear. There were conversations in cemeteries that deserved privacy. Dorothy continued quietly. "If I accept—" She paused. "I'll finally have work again." A small bird landed atop the neighboring headstone. "If I refuse—" She looked towards the rising sun. "Nothing changes." She closed her eyes. "Charles, you always knew how to recognize the next right step." She remained there several minutes before standing. As she turned to leave, something caught her attention. A young army soldier, perhaps 21 years old, stood alone several rows away. He stared silently at a newly placed headstone. His uniform remained perfectly pressed. His posture remained perfectly straight. His face did not. He looked completely lost. Dorothy hesitated, then quietly walked over. She stopped several feet away. Not close enough to intrude, close enough to be present. Neither of them spoke for almost a minute. Finally, the young soldier said, "I wasn't ready." Dorothy nodded. "I know. I thought I would be. I know. My commanding officer said funerals help." She looked toward the grave. "Sometimes they begin the healing." He wiped quickly at his eyes. I don't even know why I'm crying." Dorothy smiled gently. "Because someone mattered." He laughed through the tears. "I guess that's true." She reached into her pocket, not for money, not for advice, only for a clean handkerchief. "The first one's free." He accepted it with a grateful smile. "You'll want that back." She shook her head. "No. I've learned handkerchiefs sometimes have journeys of their own." The young soldier looked confused. She simply smiled. "Take care of yourself." Then she walked away. He never learned her name. She never learned his. Neither of them needed to. Later that afternoon, Isaiah visited the Veterans Outreach Center, still weeks away from opening. Workers installed furniture throughout the building. Boxes filled hallways. Fresh paint scented the air. Emily walked beside him carrying construction updates. "The counseling rooms are finished. The kitchen passes inspection tomorrow. The volunteer office still needs computers." Isaiah nodded distractedly. His attention rested on the reception desk near the entrance. He imagined Dorothy sitting there, greeting veterans by name, remembering birthdays, noticing when someone looked quieter than usual. The building suddenly felt complete, even before she had accepted. A construction supervisor approached. "We're ready to order the dedication plaque." Isaiah looked at the draft. Brooks Veterans Community Center, founded through the Brooks Family Foundation. He stared at the wording for several moments, then quietly handed it back. "I'd like to change something." The supervisor waited. "Remove my family name." Emily looked surprised. "What?" Isaiah smiled. The building isn't about us? What should it say? He thought of his father's letter. Charles, Dorothy. Then answered. No one has forgotten Veterans Community Center. The supervisor blinked. That's unusual. Isaiah smiled. So was the woman who inspired it. That evening, Grace found Dorothy sitting outside the diner watching the sunset. The folder rested unopened beside her. You still haven't decided? Dorothy shook her head. I keep thinking someone else deserves it. Grace sat beside her. Someone else? Younger. Better qualified. Grace smiled knowingly. Dorothy. How many people came through the diner today? She thought. Maybe 60. How many names do you remember? Dorothy frowned. Most of them. How many orders? Nearly all. Grace laughed. See? That's not unusual. It absolutely is. Grace leaned back. You remember who likes extra butter? You remember who lost a spouse? You remember which veteran gets nervous around loud noises? She smiled warmly. You notice people. Dorothy lowered her eyes. I just pay attention. Grace gently nudged the folder. Exactly. The following morning, Isaiah arrived early once again. This time he found Dorothy waiting near the old oak tree, rather than at the grave. She smiled as he approached. I've been looking for you. I've been looking for you too. He laughed. I suppose that saved us both some walking. They began strolling slowly along one of the quiet cemetery paths. Neither hurried to speak. Finally, Dorothy stopped. I have a condition. Isaiah looked surprised. A condition? If I accept the position. He nodded. I'm listening. I don't want anyone knowing you hired me because of Charles. Isaiah answered immediately. They won't. I don't want speeches. There won't be. I don't want newspaper stories. There won't be. I don't want people whispering that someone felt sorry for me. Isaiah smiled gently. They won't have the chance. Dorothy looked carefully into his eyes. And if someday I'm not good enough. She took a slow breath. I want you to let me go. Isaiah shook his head. If someday you're not good enough. He smiled. I'll assume the rest of us stopped learning from you. She laughed. That's not an answer. It is. Then his expression grew serious. Dorothy. When I offered you this position, I wasn't hiring someone because she cleaned my father's friend's grave. I was hiring the woman who made everyone around her kinder without ever asking them to change. He paused. I've watched guards become gentler. I've watched volunteers work harder. I've watched myself become quieter. That's leadership. Dorothy felt tears gathering unexpectedly. No one had described her life that way before. Leadership. She had always thought she was simply surviving. Isaiah reached into his jacket. He removed the employment agreement, not sliding it toward her, simply holding it. No pressure. You can still say no. Dorothy looked toward Samuel Brooks's grave in the distance, then toward the morning sun rising over Arlington. Finally, she smiled. I've kept one promise for 6 years. She accepted the folder. Maybe it's time to begin keeping another. Isaiah's smile widened. Does that mean? She nodded once. Yes. Not because I need saving. She extended her hand. Because I still have something to give. Isaiah shook her hand with quiet respect. He knew at that moment the outreach center had not merely gained an employee, it had gained its heart. The grand opening of the No One Is Forgotten Veterans Community Center was scheduled for the first Monday in October. Isaiah insisted on keeping the ceremony small. No television cameras, no politicians making speeches, no oversized ribbons stretching across the entrance, only veterans, their families, volunteers, employees, and the people who had quietly helped build the center from the beginning. Emily Carter looked over the guest list one final time. "You know the press will be disappointed." Isaiah smiled. "They'll recover. They're already asking why the Brooks Foundation isn't putting your name on the building." He looked toward the new bronze sign outside the entrance. "No one is forgotten. Veterans Community Center. No founder, no donor, no billionaire. Only the words that had traveled from an old Polaroid through Charles Simpson, then Dorothy, and finally into hundreds of lives." "They don't need my name," Isaiah said quietly. "They need the message." Dorothy's first official day began long before the ceremony. She arrived at the cemetery at dawn as she always had. Her routine never changed. Fresh flowers, clean marble, a quiet greeting. A few minutes sitting beside Samuel Brooks's grave. Then she smiled. "I have somewhere new to be today." She rested one hand gently against the headstone. "But don't worry. I'll still be here tomorrow." As she walked away, Harold Jenkins waited near the pathway. He removed his cap respectfully. "I heard congratulations are in order." Dorothy laughed softly. "I suppose so." "You earned it." She shook her head. "I've been given a chance." Harold smiled. "Sometimes that's exactly what earning looks like." He reached into his jacket pocket. "I've been holding on to something." He handed her a small envelope. "What is it?" "I found it in the maintenance office." She opened it carefully. Inside were hundreds of small, handwritten notes. Short comments left over the years by cemetery visitors. "Thank you for keeping this place beautiful. The flowers always look fresh. Someone has been caring for this grave with incredible love. I don't know who cleans these stones before sunrise, but thank you." One note simply read, "Whoever keeps showing up for Captain Brooks. May someone keep showing up for you." Dorothy covered her mouth. "I never knew." Harold smiled gently. "I didn't think you needed to." She carefully returned every note to the envelope. "Thank you." "No." Harold shook his head. "Thank you." The community center filled gradually throughout the morning. Former soldiers greeted one another. Children explored the reading room. Volunteers arranged coffee and pastries. The atmosphere felt less like an official ceremony and more like a family reunion. Dorothy stood quietly near the entrance wearing a navy blazer with a simple staff badge. For the first time in years, she wore clothes that fit properly. Her hair was neatly arranged. Her shoes were new. Yet somehow she looked exactly like the woman who had arrived every morning carrying a bucket. Grace Turner walked through the doors. She stopped immediately. For several seconds, she simply stared. Dorothy laughed. "What?" Grace wiped quickly at her eyes. "I was expecting a different person." Dorothy smiled. "You found the same one." "I did." Grace embraced her. "I'm glad." "So am I." Across the lobby, Isaiah watched the exchange without interrupting. Emily stepped beside him. "You were right." "No." He smiled. "Grace was." By noon, the small ceremony began. Isaiah stepped to the front of the gathering. No podium separated him from the audience. No bright stage lights, only ordinary people standing together. He looked around the room. Many faces carried scars, some visible, some impossible to see. "My father believed," Isaiah began quietly, "that no one should ever be left behind." He paused. "I spent years believing that meant the battlefield." His eyes moved toward Dorothy, standing near the back. "I've learned it also means ordinary life." He smiled. "Sometimes the people most worth following aren't the ones giving speeches. They're the ones quietly showing up long after everyone else has gone home." The audience remained silent. "We built this center for veterans." He looked around the room. "But we've also built it for anyone who has ever believed kindness still matters." He stepped away from this front. "No ribbon. No countdown. The doors are already open." Soft applause filled the room. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, exactly as he wanted. Over the next several weeks, the center gradually became part of the community. Dorothy settled naturally into her work. No training manual could have taught what she instinctively knew. She remembered names after one meeting. She noticed when someone skipped lunch. She quietly learned which veterans preferred silence before conversation. One afternoon, an older Marine named Frank arrived angry after arguing with the Veterans Affairs office. "I've been transferred 5 times." He slammed paperwork onto the reception desk. "No one listens." Dorothy didn't interrupt. She simply listened until the anger had nowhere left to go. Finally, she said, "Would you like coffee first?" Frank blinked. "What? Coffee? I can still be angry afterward." He laughed despite himself. "That's not how customer service usually works." She smiled. "I wasn't trying to provide customer service. I was trying to welcome you." An hour later, Frank left smiling. Emily had watched the entire conversation. She found Isaiah afterward. "I've figured it out." "What?" "She never tries to solve people." Isaiah nodded. "She helps them remember they're worth solving." Weeks turned into months. The center flourished. Volunteer numbers doubled. Attendance grew steadily, not because of advertising, because veterans told one another. "There's a woman there who remembers your name. There's a place where no one rushes you. There's somewhere that feels safe." One Friday afternoon, Maya Brooks visited unexpectedly. Isaiah's 24-year-old niece had recently graduated from graduate school. She walked through the building curiously. "So this is what you've been disappearing to every day?" Isaiah smiled. "It is." Maya watched Dorothy helping an elderly veteran fill out paperwork. The woman never appeared hurried, never frustrated, even after explaining the same form 3 times. Maya whispered, "Who is she?" Isaiah answered simply, "A friend." Maya looked surprised. "I've never heard you describe anyone that way." Isaiah looked toward Dorothy. "I hadn't met the right one." Later that afternoon, Maya introduced herself. Dorothy smiled warmly. "It's nice to meet you." Maya looked around the bustling lobby. "Everyone here seems to know you." Dorothy laughed. "I mostly know them." "What's your secret?" Dorothy thought for a moment. "When someone tells you something important," she smiled. "Remember it." Maya laughed. "That's it. That's most of it." Near Christmas, Isaiah organized a small exhibition inside the community center. Not an art show. A remembrance wall. Veterans and families were invited to bring one photograph and one written memory of someone they never wanted forgotten. The response overwhelmed everyone. Within days, the walls filled. Young soldiers, old Marines, military nurses, friends, parents, spouses, children. Beside every photograph hung a handwritten story. The exhibition quickly became the quietest room in the building. People entered, talking. They usually left reflecting. At the center of the display stood a simple glass case. Inside rested an enlarged copy of the old Polaroid. Beside it, a small plaque read, "No one is forgotten while someone still shows up. Anonymous family keepsake." Dorothy noticed the word, anonymous. She smiled. Isaiah walked beside her. "I hoped you'd approve." She looked at the display. "I do. You noticed I didn't include your name." "I noticed," he smiled. "It never belonged to one person." She looked around the room filled with photographs. "No. It belongs to everyone." Across the exhibition hall, visitors quietly read one another's memories. Some cried, some smiled, some simply stood holding hands. Dorothy realized the promise Charles had once made to a single friend had quietly become something much larger. Not because anyone planned it, because kindness faithfully repeated has a way of multiplying long after the people who begin it are gone. Winter arrived quietly in Washington. The trees surrounding Arlington National Cemetery surrendered their last leaves one by one. Morning frost settled across the marble headstones before the sun climbed high enough to melt it away. Dorothy's routine remained unchanged. She still arrived before dawn. She still carried fresh flowers. She still paused before Samuel Brooks's grave. The only difference was what came afterward. Instead of returning to the blue minivan behind Grace's diner, she now drove to the community center in a modest used sedan. The foundation had helped her finance through a standard employee vehicle program. Isaiah had insisted on one condition. It would not be a gift. It would be purchased through the same employee assistance program offered to everyone. Dorothy accepted immediately. Dignity mattered. Fairness mattered just as much. 3 months after accepting her position, Dorothy unlocked the community center each morning. She switched on the lobby lights, started fresh coffee, checked the appointment schedule. Then she walked through every room before anyone arrived, not inspecting, welcoming. She believed buildings like people deserved to be greeted. One Monday morning, she found a young veteran sitting outside before opening hours. He couldn't have been older than 26. His duffel bag rested beside him. He stared at the sidewalk, not moving. Dorothy unlocked the front door. "We don't officially open for another 15 minutes. The young man immediately stood. "I'm sorry. I can wait." She smiled. "Coffee's already made." He hesitated. "I don't want to be any trouble." Dorothy stepped aside. "Then don't." He looked surprised. "I've learned something," she said. "People who apologize before they've done anything wrong usually need kindness more than instructions." He followed her inside. An hour later, she learned his name was David Morales. He had spent 2 nights sleeping in his truck after losing his apartment. By noon, he had spoken with a housing counselor. By Friday, he had accepted temporary accommodation arranged through the center. As he left that afternoon, David stopped at the reception desk. "You know," he smiled sheepishly, "when I came here, I thought I was asking for help." Dorothy looked up from her paperwork. "Weren't you?" "I don't think so anymore." "What do you mean?" "I think—" He searched for the right words. "I was looking for someone who didn't make me feel broken." Dorothy smiled warmly. "I'm glad you found them." David laughed. "I found her." The stories spread quietly, not through advertising, through people. A widow told another widow. A veteran told his old platoon. A military spouse recommended the center during a support meeting. Everyone seemed to describe the same thing. "There's a woman there who listens like she has nowhere else to be." Isaiah noticed the change in numbers. Attendance continued rising. Volunteer applications doubled again. Donation letters increasingly mentioned not the building, but the atmosphere. One donor wrote, "I've never walked into a place that feels so peaceful. Please don't change whatever you're doing." Isaiah smiled after reading it. He knew exactly what they were doing. They were protecting the culture. Culture Dorothy created simply by living it every day. One afternoon, Emily entered Isaiah's office carrying financial reports. The center exceeded every projection. Isaiah looked up. "Financially?" "Not exactly." She handed him a different report. Volunteer retention, counseling completion, employment placements, housing assistance, family reunification. Every category had surpassed expectations. Emily laughed. "Our consultants are asking what program we're using." Isaiah smiled. "What did you tell them?" "I told them we hired Dorothy." Emily shook her head. They wanted a more technical answer. Isaiah leaned back. "Sometimes there isn't one." Near Christmas, Grace Turner closed her diner early for the first time in years. She drove directly to the community center carrying 3 large trays of homemade pies. Dorothy met her at the entrance. "You shouldn't have done all this." Grace grinned. "I've been feeding you for years." Now I figured I'd feed everyone else too. The holiday gathering filled every room. Children decorated cookies. Veterans exchanged stories. Volunteers laughed over coffee. Soft Christmas music played quietly in the background. No one rushed. No one watched the clock. Near the fireplace, Harold Jenkins spoke with Officer Brian Collins. "I hardly recognize her." Brian smiled. "She hasn't changed." Harold nodded. "You're right. The circumstances did." Across that room, Dorothy knelt beside an elderly veteran, helping him wrap a present for his granddaughter. She carefully tied the ribbon despite his trembling hands. He smiled gratefully. "My wife always wrapped the gifts." "I never learned." Dorothy handed him the finished package. "Looks to me like you just did." He laughed. "So it does." Isaiah watched the exchange from across the room. Maya quietly stepped beside him. "Still think she's just your employee?" Isaiah smiled. "No." "What is she?" He thought carefully. "The Standard." Maya looked confused. "For what?" "For the kind of person I hope this foundation becomes." Late that evening, after everyone had gone home, Dorothy remained behind, collecting empty coffee cups. Isaiah found her stacking chairs. "You know the staff can do that tomorrow." She smiled. "I know. I like finishing what I start." Together they worked quietly for several minutes. Finally, Isaiah spoke. "I've been thinking." Dorothy laughed softly. "That's usually dangerous." "It usually is." He leaned against one of the tables. "When I first met you, I thought I was watching someone keep a promise." She continued folding tablecloths. "Weren't you?" "I was. But now I think I was watching something else." She looked up. "What?" "The kind of life that creates promises worth keeping." Dorothy became very still. No one had ever described Charles that way. Or her. She smiled gently. "Charles used to say," she folded another chair, "people spend too much time asking how they'll be remembered." Isaiah waited. He believed a better question was... She looked around the now empty room. "How many people will remember to be kinder because they met you?" Isaiah quietly absorbed the thought. "I think he succeeded." "So do I." A week later, Dorothy arrived at Arlington, carrying something different beneath her arm. Not flowers, not cleaning supplies. A framed photograph. She placed it carefully beside Samuel Brooks's grave. It was the enlarged copy of the old Polaroid displayed temporarily at the community center during the Remembrance exhibition. The original remained safely stored inside Charles's wooden keepsake box. This copy belonged here. Isaiah arrived a few minutes later. "You brought it." She nodded. "I thought Samuel deserved to see what happened." He smiled. "I think he'd approve." Together they stood looking across the cemetery. Rows of white headstones stretched toward the horizon. "So many stories," Isaiah whispered. Dorothy nodded. "So many people still waiting to be remembered." Isaiah looked at her. "Do you ever think your work is finished?" She smiled. "I hope not." He laughed. "Why?" "Because as long as someone still feels forgotten." She adjusted one of the fresh white lilies. "Someone still needs to show up?" The morning sun slowly climbed above the winter trees. Its warm light spread across Samuel Brooks's grave, across Charles Simpson's memory, across Dorothy, across Isaiah. Neither of them realized a quiet photographer standing far away had captured that moment. Not for a newspaper, not for publicity, only because something about two ordinary people standing together before a grave reminded him that some of the greatest acts of love leave almost no noise behind, and somehow those are the ones the world remembers the longest. The photograph taken that winter morning remained unknown to Dorothy, unknown to Isaiah, unknown even to the quiet photographer who had slipped it into a personal folder before returning to his ordinary life. Some moments never asked to become famous. They simply waited until someone needed them. Months passed. Spring slowly returned to Washington. Cherry blossoms appeared along the Potomac. Fresh green leaves replaced bare branches throughout Arlington National Cemetery. Dorothy continued arriving before sunrise every day. Rain, snow, heat, holiday. Nothing interrupted the promise she had made nearly 7 years earlier. The guards no longer checked her identification with unfamiliar caution. New employees quickly learned who she was, not because of her position at the community center, because older staff quietly told them, if you ever wonder what respect looks like, watch the woman with the flowers. One Tuesday morning, Harold Jenkins approached Dorothy carrying a small wooden box. It was no larger than a hardcover book. Its oak surface showed the marks of age. I've been meaning to give you this. Dorothy looked surprised. What it? It belonged to Samuel Brooks. She stared at him. I don't understand. Harold smiled. When the Brooks family donated several personal items to the cemetery archives years ago. He gently ran his fingers across the lid. This box was accidentally placed with maintenance storage instead of archival records. It was recently discovered during inventory. Dorothy looked toward Isaiah, who had just arrived several steps away. He stopped when he saw the box. I've never seen that before. Harold nodded. Neither had I. He handed it carefully to Isaiah. It belongs to your family? Isaiah immediately looked at Dorothy. I think we should open it together. They carried the box to a quiet bench beneath the old oak tree. The wood creaked softly as Isaiah lifted the lid. Inside rested only a few carefully preserved belongings. A military compass, a faded unit patch, several black and white photographs, and one sealed envelope. Across the front in Samuel Brooks's unmistakably careful handwriting were the words, "For whoever keeps showing up." Dorothy and Isaiah looked at one another in complete silence. Neither spoke. Isaiah carefully broke the old seal. The paper inside had yellowed with age, but every word remained clear. If you're reading this, then time has done what time always does. It has carried us farther than we expected. Maybe this letter reaches my family. Maybe it reaches one of my brothers from the army. Maybe it reaches someone I never had the chance to meet. It doesn't matter. If you cared enough to open this, thank you. People often believe courage happens in one dramatic moment. They're wrong. Real courage usually looks much smaller. It looks like returning after grief, returning after disappointment, returning after people stop noticing, returning because love is still there, even when applause isn't. If someone remembers me years from now, I hope it isn't because I died in uniform. I hope it's because they remembered to care for someone else afterward. Don't build statues, build habits. Don't tell people to remember me. Help them remember each other. If you've spent your life showing up for someone who can no longer thank you, please know this. You were never alone. Samuel Brooks. Dorothy's hands began trembling. She read the letter again, then again. Every sentence felt as though it had been written directly to her. Isaiah quietly folded the page closed. I've spent my whole life wondering what my father would tell me if he had one more conversation. He smiled through wet eyes. I think he just did. Dorothy gently touched the corner of the letter. So did Charles. Word of the discovery spread only among close family and the community center staff. Isaiah refused every suggestion to publish the letter publicly. Emily looked surprised. Wouldn't people benefit from reading it? They already are, Isaiah answered. How? He smiled. By watching Dorothy. Several days later, Maya Brooks visited the cemetery carrying flowers. She had recently begun volunteering at the community center every Saturday. The experience had quietly changed her. She found Dorothy placing fresh lilies beside Samuel's grave. I wanted to ask you something. Dorothy smiled. Of course. Maya looked down at the headstone. When I was little, my uncle always told me Grandpa was a hero. He was. But I thought heroes only existed in history books. She looked at Dorothy. Now I think they keep appearing. Dorothy laughed softly. I don't know about that. I do, Maya smiled. I've watched veterans walk into the center looking defeated. They leave standing taller. You didn't fix their lives. You reminded them they still had one. Dorothy remained quiet. Maya continued. I think that's what Grandpa meant. About returning. Dorothy nodded slowly. I think you're right. That evening, Isaiah drove alone to the old house that had once belonged to his mother. He carried Samuel's letter, Charles's letter, and the original Polaroid. He sat for hours in the quiet living room reading all three again. 3 people, 3 different lives. One message, keep showing up. He realized something that had escaped him for years. His father had not changed history because of one heroic decision on a battlefield. He had changed history because his character made that decision possible. Charles had spent decades living in response to that character. Dorothy had inherited that response. Now countless veterans were experiencing kindness because one soldier had chosen compassion under impossible circumstances decades earlier. The ripple had never stopped. Isaiah quietly whispered into the empty room, "Thank you, Dad." For the first time since childhood, the words felt complete. The following week, the community center celebrated its first anniversary. There was no formal gala, only an evening meal shared among veterans, volunteers, employees, and families. During dessert, Frank the Marine, who had once arrived furious over government paperwork, stood unexpectedly. He tapped his coffee cup with a spoon. I've got something to say. The room gradually fell silent. I'm not much for speeches. Several people laughed. Frank looked toward Dorothy. When I first walked through those doors, I figured I was another problem somebody had to solve. He smiled. This woman proved me wrong. He looked around the room. Then I realized something. Every single person here thinks Dorothy changed their life. He paused. But I don't think that's true. Everyone listened. I think Dorothy reminds us to change each other's lives. Soft applause spread through the room. Dorothy shook her head modestly. You all did the work? Frank laughed. Exactly. You taught us that too. Isaiah watched quietly from the back of the room. He remembered Samuel's letter. Don't build statues, build habits. He looked around. Veterans serving food before eating themselves. Volunteers staying late to clean. Young families talking with elderly soldiers who had arrived alone. No one had instructed them to do these things. They had simply learned by watching someone who kept showing up. Isaiah finally understood. Buildings eventually age. Photographs fade. Even letters become fragile. But a habit passed from one person to another can outlive generations. And perhaps that was the greatest inheritance Samuel Brooks had ever left behind. 8 years later, the first light of dawn still arrived over Arlington National Cemetery with the same quiet patience. Morning mist drifted between rows of white marble. Birdsong echoed gently through the old oak trees. Some things had changed. Many had not. Dorothy Simpson, now 53 years old, still walked the familiar path carrying fresh white lilies every morning. Her hair showed a few more silver strands. The lines around her eyes had deepened, yet her smile remained exactly the same. She still paused before Captain Samuel Brooks's grave. She still brushed away fallen leaves. She still straightened the small American flag. She still whispered, "Good morning." Promises she had learned did not become lighter with time. They simply became part of who you were. The No One Is Forgotten Veterans Community Center had grown far beyond anyone's expectations. 3 additional locations now served military families in neighboring states. Each building looked different. Each community had different needs. Only one tradition never changed. Every new employee received the same welcome on the first morning. No orientation video, no corporate presentation. Instead, they gathered in a quiet room where a single framed sentence hung on the wall. No one is forgotten while someone still shows up. Only afterward did they learn where the words came from. Isaiah insisted the story always be told without exaggeration, never call Dorothy a hero, never describe Samuel as larger than life, never turn Charles into a legend. Tell the truth, he always reminded new staff. Truth is already extraordinary enough. David Morales, once the frightened young veteran who had arrived carrying a duffel bag, now served as director of the original center. He often laughed when new volunteers apologized for asking too many questions. I did exactly the same thing, he would tell them. Then he repeated the sentence Dorothy had once offered him. People who apologize before they've done anything wrong usually need kindness more than instructions. Few realized those words had already traveled through hundreds of conversations, perhaps thousands. No one kept count anymore. Grace Turner finally retired from the diner. The community held a small celebration, nothing elaborate, exactly as she preferred. When someone thanked her for feeding half the neighborhood for 30 years, Grace laughed. I mostly just made pie. Dorothy hugged her tightly. You also fed hope. Grace smiled. I learned that from watching someone carry flowers every morning. Even in retirement, Grace volunteered twice each week at the community center kitchen. Some habits refused to disappear. Harold Jenkins retired from Arlington shortly afterward. On his final morning, the cemetery staff presented him with a framed photograph. It showed sunrise over Samuel Brooks's grave. Fresh lilies rested beside the headstone. No people appeared in the picture, only evidence that someone had been there. Harold smiled through tears. They understood, he whispered. What? Brian Collins asked. Harold gently touched the frame. The most important person in the picture. He smiled. Is the one you can't see. Officer Brian Collins eventually became cemetery superintendent. Whenever new security officers questioned why one woman always entered before official opening hours, Brian simply answered, some visitors are part of the place. No one questioned it again. Maya Brooks established a scholarship for military families, pursuing careers in nursing counseling and social work. She named it neither after Isaiah nor Samuel. She called it the Charles and Dorothy Promise Scholarship. When reporters asked why, Maya answered simply, because gratitude should keep moving. Nothing more, nothing less. One cool autumn afternoon, a school bus stopped outside the community center. A class of middle school students entered for a local history project. Their teacher encouraged them to interview veterans and volunteers. One little girl wandered toward the remembrance wall. The old Polaroid still rested inside its glass case. Its edges had faded slightly over the years. Beside it remained the same handwritten sentence. The girl looked up at Dorothy. Were you there? Dorothy smiled. I was. Did you know the people in the picture? I knew some of them. The girl frowned thoughtfully. My teacher says history is about important people. Dorothy knelt beside her. I think history is also about ordinary people. She gently pointed toward the photograph. Who keep making ordinary choices. The girl studied the picture again. Like bringing flowers? Dorothy smiled. Exactly. The child nodded seriously as though she had just learned something that would stay with her forever. Perhaps she had. Later that evening, Isaiah arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee. He found Dorothy sitting on the familiar bench outside the center after everyone had gone home. You still work too late. He handed her a cup. So do you. They laughed. Comfortable silence settled between them. It had become one of their oldest friendships. Neither needed to fill every quiet moment with conversation. Finally, Isaiah looked toward the darkening sky. "I've been thinking about my father." Dorothy smiled. "That happens often." "It does." He looked toward the building. "I used to wonder what kind of legacy he left." "And now?" Isaiah slowly shook his head. "I asked the wrong question." Dorothy waited. "The better question isn't what he left. It's what keeps growing." She nodded. "Love rarely stays where it begins." Isaiah smiled. "You've been saying that for years." "I know. Still true." She looked through the large front windows of the community center. Inside, a young volunteer carefully helped an elderly veteran put on his coat before locking the doors. Neither realized they were being watched. Dorothy smiled softly. More true every year. That winter, on the anniversary of Samuel Brooks's sacrifice, Arlington held a quiet remembrance ceremony. No television cameras attended, no famous speakers appeared. Families gathered. Veterans stood together. Children placed flowers. At the conclusion of the ceremony, Brian Collins invited Dorothy to say a few words. She almost declined. Public speaking had never been comfortable. But Isaiah gently nodded. She stepped forward. The crowd became still. Dorothy looked across the rows of white headstones. "I used to think," she began quietly, "that keeping a promise meant never missing a day." She smiled gently. "I understand something different now." She looked toward Samuel's grave. "A promise isn't measured by perfection. It's measured by returning. Returning after grief. Returning after mistakes. Returning after life becomes busy. Returning because love is more important than convenience." Many people lowered their heads. Some quietly wiped away tears. Dorothy continued. If you leave here remembering only one thing," she paused. "Don't remember my name. Don't remember this story. Remember someone who might believe they've been forgotten. Then, show up." Nothing followed. No dramatic applause. Only a long, thoughtful silence. Sometimes silence carried gratitude better than sound. The next morning, dawn arrived exactly as it always had. Dorothy walked alone toward Samuel Brooks's grave, carrying fresh white lilies. She cleaned the marble, straightened the small flag. Then, before leaving, she placed a new Polaroid beneath the flowers. Not of herself, not of Samuel. It showed volunteers, veterans, children, and families laughing together outside the community center. On the back, she had written only one sentence. "Your promise kept growing." She smiled. "I thought you'd like to know." As she walked away, another visitor quietly approached the neighboring grave. Seeing the fresh flowers, he gently removed a few fallen leaves from a different headstone nearby before continuing on. He never realized why he had done it. Perhaps kindness rarely announces where it begins. Perhaps it simply moves from one heart to another unnoticed until the world slowly becomes gentler because someone somewhere chose to keep showing up. Here's a heartfelt closing message you can use at the end of your video. Sometimes the greatest heroes are not the ones whose names are carved into history books, but the ordinary people who quietly choose kindness when no one is watching. Dorothy never had wealth, power, or recognition. She simply kept showing up day after day, year after year, because love had taught her that remembering someone is an act of gratitude, and serving others is an act of hope. In the end, it wasn't money that changed lives. It was consistency. It was compassion. It was the courage to keep doing the right thing long after the applause had faded. Every small act of kindness creates a ripple that reaches people we may never meet. A comforting word, a helping hand, a visit, a prayer, or even a few moments of genuine attention can become the reason someone believes they are not alone. The world doesn't become better because of a few extraordinary people. It becomes better because ordinary people make extraordinary choices every single day. So wherever you are today, remember this. Someone in your life may simply be waiting for another person to show up. Be that person. You may never fully understand the difference you make, but your kindness can become a legacy that outlives you. If this story touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what lesson stayed with you the most. And if you enjoy inspiring stories about hope, compassion, and the power of ordinary people, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications